Hello, everybody. This is a hopefully not too long video for the module SW6016 Final Practice Learning Experience. And it's about reflexivity and critical incidence. And hope really overall aim, as it were, is to perhaps provide some additional information that might be appropriate for your critical analyses, two of which you have to do this year. So we'll start off with a definition. There are other definitions, but basic definition, and then some thoughts on reflexivity and what do we mean by this. Then an introduction to critical incidence and how might these ideas be applied to your critical analyses with a couple of models thrown in. So reflexivity is from the Cambridge definition, dictionary definition. Other definitions are available, but in any event, the fact of someone being able to examine their own feelings, reactions, motives, motives being their reasons for acting, and how these influence what they do or think in a situation. So there's a bit of unpicking, and I suppose one might reasonably ask, is that different from reflection? Well, I think so, because it foregrounds our own biases, perhaps, our own sense of power, lack of power, perhaps, and how we influence the situations that we're actually reflecting about. And this little picture here is Jan Fuchs, a well-known academic, particularly writing about reflection and practice in social work contexts. Wrote an excellent article with Fuchs and Askeland, 2007, a few years old, still worth reading. And she was thinking of the problems with reflection in this Nothing Ventured, Nothing Gained article, certainly something I would recommend you have a read of. So she kind of mentions critical incident analysis, a powerful transformative activity. But when you have a powerful transformative activity, there's likely to be some risks involved. So very much a thread that runs throughout Jan Fuchs' writing is about unearthing deeper assumptions, and sometimes about culture, about power, about values, about bias, things that are not immediately obvious or not immediately on the surface. So I suppose this means, obviously, that the reflexivity and reflection is happening within social contexts. Reflection can promote cultures of silence, individualism, and secrecy. This is her thesis. You may or may not agree with that. And she kind of suggests 3 issues to note: assumptions regarding interpersonal communication and dialogue. Maybe they're kind of assumptions that not everybody can feel like they are part of. It might not be a widespread practice. There might be cultural assumptions made about this that might not be widely applicable. There is definitely something about professional helping and workplace cultures. Does the culture trump the reflection, as it were? Is the culture more important in its assumptions and driving what we actually do than our reflections would indicate we should do? And of course, there are assumptions about knowledge, learning, research, and the place of emotions. So these are kind of real life issues that come up in reflection and reflective practice. And then the question becomes, what might you do about them? So just kind of a little note here that reflection has been criticized for placing all the emphasis, pardon me, on the individual. You've seen this acronym before: white, educated, industrial, rich, democratic. That's our basic sample for most of the research in psychology, which we kind of frequently import into social work and most of our kind of social work research too. Now that picture is changing over time, but at the moment our sample is about 5% of the global population. And you kind of think, is that applicable to everybody, everywhere, at all times? Chances are not. But really, the truth of the matter is we don't actually know. So unless you expand your kind of concept of some of the ideas we're looking at, you won't know. You have to find out. There's certainly a powerful argument for reflection, and critical incidents might work better in groups. We're usually used to thinking about reflection and reflection of critical incidents as an individual or maybe a dyad, two people involved in doing this. The radical tradition of social work would certainly foreground group work, and it seemed very clear to me that apprentices, students, learners in general appreciate opportunity for sitting together in groups, and you get a different type of learning from those situations. And obviously, we need to consider social context and power, and that might not be as easy as it seems. Now, at this stage, you've probably read this little quote here. It's from the University of Southampton. But the second part of this has the potential to identify how underlying values, assumptions, and beliefs affect the synthesis, dissemination, exchange, and application of findings. A rather long way around of saying that the reflexivity of the learner is changed by this ability to examine what's going on under the bonnet of the car, as it were. What is driving the engine? What is not immediately obvious from looking at the car, but nonetheless has a powerful um, impetus in what we learn, what we think, what we do. And Bolton follows on from this um, suggesting we should find strategies to question our own attitudes, thought processes, values, and so on and so on. And in particular, habitual actions, because it may be easier in some ways to think about our values, assumptions, etc., etc. And it gets more difficult when we talk about our prejudices and particularly our habitual actions, because those are things we do quite often without questioning. There is a part of this, of course, to understand our roles in relation to other people. And partly my reading in any event is a kind of a recognition that we sometimes create cultures in jobs and in our work and in our teams that are actually discriminatory and biased and perhaps don't kind of have the best interests of our people with lived experience at heart and destructive of diversity, as she suggests, and institutionalizing power balance where the agency or the organization's needs are prioritized over the actual individuals you're supposed to serve. Now, these are long-standing debates, but nonetheless, there's still a professional duty to examine and explore these things because I'm sure none of us planned or set out to kind of ensure our agencies don't always live up to our values. But nonetheless, in some way, shape, or form, we contribute in some way to these processes. And so, therefore, perhaps we need to be live or alive to them and their potential to marginalize or exclude people and maybe develop strategies to avoid that happening. So that's a little bit about reflexivity. I suppose some people might think, is that any different from reflection, Dermot? I think it kind of is bringing a critical self-examination into the mix in a way that reflection might not prioritize, perhaps. Or I suppose people could say, well, it's just an intellectual kind of little mind game. I'm not really too sure that that is the case, but it's at least worth thinking about. Now, critical incident analysis. Now, we are actually asking you to do two critical analyses. You'll all be fully aware of that. But this is a particular approach which looks at incidents. So let's kind of trawl through this a little bit and see what we mean. So the first question is, of course, what is a critical incident? Now, this little chapter 10 in the book by Lister, Integrating Social Work Theory and Practice, blah, 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 is quite an interesting little overview. You could have a little look at that there. But there are incidents which cause us to think and reflect about ourselves, organizations, processes, etc., etc. You can read the quote. The kind of one of the important points, at least here, is that these incidents do not have to be dramatic or obvious. They can be really ordinary things. So I suppose the tendency sometimes to kind of talk about the thing that really made a major impression on you. My case went all wrong. There was some sort of conflict, etc., and how it resolved or not resolved, those kind of things. And those things are important to us. But equally, the important learning might be something really, really small that needs sitting with and kind of percolating, I suppose, in a sense. So they don't have to be big, kind of dramatic things. Now, there's some resources here. I'm going to kind of actually go through some of these articles and say how they offer a slightly different perspective, different ways of doing critical analysis, as it were. So hopefully that'll become a little bit clearer as we go on. The first one here is Brookfield. Now, Stephen Brookfield's a very interesting person, very well known in the field of education in particular, and talks about kind of liberating education and things of that nature, and very much about critical reflection, anti-discriminatory practice, decolonizing the curriculum. I suppose you would describe him as coming from a more kind of radical position, if indeed radical is a word that you might ever apply to kind of, I don't know, people like me, white, middle class, middle age, yes, middle age, not ancient, kind of men, nominally cisgender, whatever. Do you know what I mean? Nonetheless, he recognizes his privilege, as people in my position should always do. And he has some interesting things about critical analysis. Now, when he is training teachers, that's what he does, among many other things. He has a little set of questions about moments, critical incidents in the classroom, and I've adapted these questions for direct observations. So it's fairly simple thinking about direct observation. At what moment did you feel most engaged with what was happening? Now, as you kind of go through these questions, it might be something worth thinking about yourself that you could apply, particularly in your final year, to direct observations, because they are very powerful in their own way. There's lots of little moments, kind of little important learning moments that happen in these, and it might be worth as a reflection of itself just to kind of rattle through these questions um, when you perhaps come to the end of the feedback elements. At what moment were you most distant from what was happening? There are times when we just simply zone out, get various kind of reactions that we have to a particular situation are always worth thinking about. But nonetheless, there we go. What action that anyone took did you find most affirming or helpful? Or find most puzzling or confusing? Quite often that happens in direct observations, isn't it? We're kind of faced with a kind of a thorny, knotty problem. We're going to go, what is happening? And of course, the best way is to try to talk it through, work it out, and see what's going on. But those things are not unusual in direct observations. And of course, sometimes we're simply surprised by what happened. I wasn't expecting that. So that's just one example of how Brookfield uses critical analysis, and I've kind of adapted for direct observations, but it might be in a much smaller interaction with other people. So obviously, when we think about a critical incident, um, I suppose a lot of people would immediately think about where something went really badly. Now, this is a little poster there for the National Stephen Lawrence Day, which is 22nd of April. I'm guessing most people know about Stephen Lawrence, but I suppose can't make any assumptions. This was a young man who was murdered by a bunch of other young men, which has led to a long, long chase for justice and fight and struggle for justice by his parents. Doreen Lawrence, in particular, has been a national figure trying to get the police to take responsibility for racist kind of approaches to the investigation of Stephen's murder. The ripples spread far and wide. It led to a thing called the Macpherson Report. Typical way of dealing with things in the UK is you get an inquiry, it goes on for years and years. But in this instance, the inquiry stated that the Metropolitan Police Service were institutionally racist, that had contributed to the very, very long fight for justice that the Lawrence family had to be involved in, had to be engaged in, had to push for decades, in actual fact. So Public inquiry is not critical incident analysis, really. However, a critical incident here in the terms of the police and the Lawrence inquiry is any incident where the effectiveness of the police response is likely to have a significant impact on the confidence of the victim, their family, and or the community. And there's no doubt that Stephen Lawrence's murder was a critical incident in those terms. So it's not to say that, um, how would I say that don't do this in your own critical analysis. I'm kind of hoping you don't have to do this in your own critical analysis because, it is social work after all that you're engaged in, and sometimes people do die, and sometimes people do get hurt, and we hope that's a rare occurrence, but it still does. And we hope that the police are not going to be involved in any way, shape, or form investigating any critical incident you analyze. But it is worth at least saying here that when we think about critical incident analysis, we have to include a wider range of things. So, now we're getting a little bit closer to something that might be useful for your particular written assignment that you have to do. And this is Nairn and Blom, and it was about an analysis of short reflective narratives. And here the idea was, instead of interviewing people, because Myron and Blom are researchers and they're doing qualitative research, and a very typical thing they do is a semi-structured interview. You have a theme for the interview and you have a set of questions that you may or may not ask all of them, but you're kind of investigating a particular theme with a social worker or a person with lived experience, whoever it happens to be. So here, instead of actually doing the oral tradition and talking it through, they're asked to write down a narrative. In other traditions, from Paulo Freire and people like this, they call this a code, a kind of a typical pattern of behavior that happens. Maybe in the modern day, we could call it a meme of sorts. But writing down actually makes us kind of come up with a different way of thinking, a different way of analyzing. Um, I mean, anytime you translate what's inside your head either into voice or into writing, you actually do it, translate it into art, painting, music, dance, whatever it happens to be. But, when you make a narrative, then you get a different quality, a different lens, a different way of looking at things. And then you can investigate or try to uncover sources of knowledge. That obviously might be ideas about social work practice, theory, the usual kind of medley of stuff, but also personal knowledge, the knowledge of the other person, um, the knowledge of culture, tradition, whatever it happens to be. And you're asked in this way to identify the sources of knowledge. So that's one way of doing critical analysis. Articles worth a look. And here, this article is quite old, but I still feel it's um, kind of both interesting and important. You'll see it's from the Journal of Multicultural Social Work, a journal you might have a little look at. I'm not sure that we actually have access to that in the library. Okay. So they start off from, a fairly standard viewpoint that reflection can be technical, what went wrong in the process, do you know what I mean? Which is another way of learning things. It can be practical or emancipatory. Emancipatory means liberating or freeing. And Montalvo says that this can be demanding and emotionally painful, but can result in confidence in one's own practice. This is quite an interesting take. And this is a class where a woman is describing an incident when she was a child that gave her the impression she was an inferior person. A light-skinned woman making a comment about Mexicans not knowing their place. Now, we can see and feel the pain of this. A 5 or 6 year old may not um, understand fully what's going on here, but I am sure they feel it. And there may be people who are watching this video who have had that experience. or people who have had the experience of being excluded in some way, shape, or form by the discriminatory, and in some sense, racist attitudes of other people. And so she uses this as kind of an understanding, a clear understanding of her place in the world and as a professional, but notes it is not something you get used to. Mm. So sometimes moments like this give us moments for pause, perhaps, and reflection. But there's an active engagement with this process here, a willingness in some senses to uncover things that are uh, both difficult, painful, and perhaps, as it says here, emancipatory. Again, worth having a look at. And I'm going to end with a critical incident analysis tool, Lister and Chris Bletters. Again, quite well known in the social work literature, but it just suggests quite simply a model. And this is something I could see might be quite useful for your critical analysis because it's got a kind of very clear structure. You got 16 and 100 words thereabouts for this. So a kind of fairly tight structure might sometimes help. And it maybe adds to the menu of models, reflective models that you already have. So it's divided, as you can see, into 4 different elements, and just say a little bit about what each of these elements are. So the first bit is initial responses to the incident, which might be analogous in other models to a description. Always try to keep the descriptive element short when you're doing these things because, it's the reflection where the value is, isn't it? There is a temptation because I suppose if nothing else, case recording indicates that you should put a lot of detail about what happened. We know that people don't always do that in actual real world. Um, but it's a question of balance. Try to um, describe minimally, but your initial responses is a slightly different thing, isn't it? What were your thoughts and feelings? Um, were there other kind of parts of the response to individuals, systems, whatever? You can see the question. It's very straightforward. Then we move on to issues and dilemmas highlighted by this incident because there's going to be something problematic, most likely. There's practice dilemmas, and I suppose some of that is conflicts in values where you have competing values or competing interests, different people, how people come in conflict with systemic processes, organizational demands, availability, resources, and so on. The values and ethical issues might be interpersonal, can be actually quite complicated, and of course, interdisciplinary or interagency collaborations, just by their very nature, generate kind of things that are complex and difficult to solve at times. So you move on then from learning. And this is really, of course, what we want to see. With any of these reflective models, critical incident models, whatever they are, you have to complete the cycle. We are only describing and then saying a thought and felt and just leaving it at that. No learning really has taken place. Observation has taken place, but we need to complete the cycle. So just be careful of that when you're using this model or other models. Now, by this stage, you've probably kind of read through while you're listening, but you can see theory, research, legislative, organizational policy, etc., etc. We're asked to kind of pull out those threads a little bit, and perhaps again, going back to my earlier metaphor, to look under the bonnet of what's driving practice and what conflicts can result, for example, from following procedures and interagency practice to the letter, but nonetheless, the person that we're working with is not getting the service that they deserve or should have. So you can see from those kind of processes that we should be in a better position to pull out the learning. And learning should, in some way, shape, or form, point forward. It is a good idea to go back and reflect in the moment, but we have to develop our practice, don't we? So that means learning has to kind of, in a sense, face forward and have a new set of outcomes and ideas and practice and thoughts for what we will do in a similar situation should it occur again. or in similar situations, which will almost certainly occur again. So really, that's my summary. At this stage, as far as you're kind of looking at this video, you're probably around the point where you should actually be submitting a draft of your critical analysis. You know that I'm always going to tell you, please do the draft. Draft is a great way to get a little bit of quick feedback, kind of fix things or kind of draw attention to things that you might not see because you're too close to other people sitting there typing away draft. You know what I mean? It helps improve your work, and perhaps even of itself is a reflective process. So, just to very, very briefly summarize, this was about reflexivity initially, this idea that we examine our own influence in the situation, our thoughts, our prejudices, our biases, our previous histories that we are bringing to the reflective process. And um, really, the idea of reflexivity is also to uncover the power dynamics, maybe the organizational drivers and values, etc., that are kind of working in a subterranean way, as I say, under the bonnet, to drive action and need to be brought into the light of day, to be kind of more consciously observed, shall we say, and changed. Then we looked at a number of different critical incident definitions and models and approaches. There's a few articles there that may or may not be of interest to you. I suppose the main point is people do these things in different ways, so there are a range of ways that you might actually approach this. And I have actually used a commonly used critical incident analysis model or tool at the end, four-stage thing that might well be useful to your essay writing because it's actually quite concise and clear, and it might add structure to what is essentially a quite short but also quite dense um, assignment. So that's quite enough for today. I am now going to end the recording. Thank you for your patience in listening to this, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.